In the previous video, we have looked at how the government policies can affect the output in the economy, given that we have different balance of payment line, given that we have an elastic or inelastic balance of payment line, given that we have an imperfect capital mobility in the market. In this video, we'll talk about the same topic, imperfect capital mobility, but in the case where we have a flexible exchange rate. Situation number one is when the government implements monetary policy. Keep in mind, when the government implements monetary policy for a flexible exchange rate, the analysis we have for a flatter BP line, let's see if we can draw that, flatter BP line is the same as the analysis we have for a steeper BP line. So therefore in this diagram, therefore in this analysis, I have decided not to include the inelastic BP line because the analysis is exactly identical. So if I were to include it, will make it more complicated. Our initial equilibrium point our initial equilibrium point is at E0 and Y1. We know when the government implements monetary policy, our money supply in the economy is going to increase, and when the money supply in the economy increases, our LM curve shifts towards the right from LM0 to LM1. That is something that we understand from our basic knowledge. That is going to create a new equilibrium point. That is going to create a new equilibrium point of, let's say that we have E1. So we would go from E0. So this is going to result that we go from E0 all the way from E1. However, when this happens, there are two other things simultaneous with this action. The first one is our BP curve would shift towards the right. Now, why is that happening? In a fixed exchange rate, our monetary policy or fiscal policy, it has no consequence on the shifting of the BP curve, because we assume in a fixed exchange rate the government does not want to change the exchange rate, meaning the government is trying to maintain a fixed exchange rate, so therefore the BP curve does not shift. But in a flexible exchange rate, the market forces can change the BP curve. Why is that? Because if you watch the previous videos, you will know that the definition or the mathematical equation for a BP curve is essentially our exports, which comprises of foreign income and exchange rate. Or in some textbooks they use a symbol pi. In this diagram they're using the symbol pi for exchange rate, plus imports, domestic income, which is a function of domestic income and exchange rate, plus our capital outflows or capital inflows, which is K R0, or domestic R is called RD, minus our international R, all of which we have gone through in the previous video. So make sure that you have watched those before watching this video. Okay, what's going to happen? Our BP curve is going to shift towards right. Why is that? Because as you can see that our R0 will go from R0 all the way to R1. Our interest rate would decrease, and when our interest rate decreases, we know that we are going to have a capital outflow. When interest rate decreases, we'll have a capital outflow. Whenever we have a capital outflow, we know that the currency is going to depreciate. The currency is going to depreciate, and when the currency depreciates, we know that our exchange rate, we know that our exports would go up. Why is the export going up? Because if the currency depreciates, foreigners can use their income to buy more of the goods, because their currency would have more buying power, and this is gonna cause the IS curve. So all of this is going to cause the IS curve to shift towards the right. So we'll go from IS0 to IS1, which is represented over here. Let me see if I can do that. We go from IS0 to IS1, and at the same time our BP curve shifts from BP to BP1. Why is that happening? Because our exchange rate is changing. In a fixed market, we assume that the exchange rate are constant. But in flexible exchange rate, the exchange rate can change. So if the exchange rate changes, as you can see from these two diagrams, our BP curve is going to shift towards right. And when we factor in these two effects, as you can see from the diagram, we will have a new equilibrium output of E2, where we have where we go from y0 all the way to y1, and then from y1 we move all the way to y2 because of increase in the because of the shift in the IS curve and shift in the BP curve. And this would create a new equilibrium output in the economy. As you can see that this is going to be a very effective policy. If our BP curve is more inelastic, meaning if our BP curve, let's say, is more steeper, let me see if I can quickly draw. We have the IS curve, we have the LM curve. Let's see if I can different color. Let's say if the BP curve is something like that, a little bit more steeper. Okay, we are going to have the same analysis. If we can zoom in, actually, hold on. Okay, we are going to have the same analysis. Our LM curve is going to shift towards the right. This is going to cause the exchange rate, because the new equilibrium point, this is the initial equilibrium point, this is a new equilibrium point. The new equilibrium point is below the BP curve or towards the right of the BP curve. This would mean the currency is going to depreciate. This is going to increase our exports. So our IS curve shifts towards the right. The IS curve moves towards the right. And because this is a flexible exchange rate, our BP curve will also move or also shift towards the right. So let's call it something like that. And we will reach a new equilibrium output. Let's say y0, this is y1. Let's call this point y2. So we have, see that again, hold on. Okay, so this is our R1, R0, and this point would be R2. Let's call it R2. So as you can see that when we try to draw these curves on our own, it can become very messy. So make sure that you are drawing them large as you can, so that it's very clear to understand. In any case, as you can notice that in both, if the BP curve is elastic or inelastic, the effect on the economy is exactly identical. And so for that reason, I have not covered the situation where our BP curve is inelastic, because analysis is exactly identical. So make sure that you do not overcomplicate the situation. Last but not the least is the effect on flexible exchange rate, given that we have an imperfect market, given that we have a fiscal policy. Now this diagram can be very tricky, so make sure that you can watch the video. So this diagram can be very tricky, so make sure that you listen. This diagram can be very tricky, so make sure that you understand properly. When we have a fiscal policy, initially we know that our IS curve is going to shift towards the right because we have an increase in government spending. So we would go in the diagram over here, we would go from IS G0, exchange rate 0, to IS G1 pi 1. In some textbook they use a symbol E, but that doesn't really matter, it's just a symbol for exchange rate. But as you can notice, we will go from equilibrium point E0 all the way to E2. Assume that when this is happening, our BP curve is not shifting. Let me see if I can draw a diagram quickly. See if I can do that. Hold on, we have over that. We have our initial IS curve. See if I can get different color. This is our LM curve. This would be our BP line. That's there. Okay, so what's going to happen? Firstly, our IS curve is going to shift towards the right. So let's say that we have a new IS curve being created. Now you will notice that this is our BP line, this is our LM, this is IS1, let's call this point IS0. You will see that our initial equilibrium point, let's say that this point is E0, this point over here is, let's just call this point E2. Okay, you will see that this point E2 is above the new equilibrium point. E2 is above the BP line, meaning we have a balance of payment surplus. And we know from our previous videos and from our previous analysis, whenever we have balance of payment surplus, our exchange rate is going to appreciate. And when the exchange rate is going to appreciate, our BP curve will shift towards the right. Whenever the exchange rate depreciates, the BP curve shifts towards the right. Whenever the exchange rate appreciates, our BP curve towards the left. And therefore our BP curve will shift towards the left. See if I can draw that. This is the reason I did not sketch the curve myself, because it can become very messy. So I used the curves already given in the textbook, so that we have a much clear understanding. Almost all textbooks have identical curves, maybe symbols a little bit different. In some textbooks they use E instead of pi, and in some textbooks they analyze the effect for a elastic and inelastic BP curve in the same diagram, but I'm not doing that because it can get complicated. So our BP curve will shift towards the right, shift towards the left, sorry. So we would have a BP1, let's call this BP0, BP1, which is represented by this point over here, because we have a greater exchange rate, we have an appreciation in the exchange rate. Well, what's going to happen as a result? Well, what's going to happen as a result? We know that whenever we have an appreciation in the currency, we are going to have an increase in imports. So imports are going to increase, and therefore our exports would decrease. And therefore what that would imply, and therefore that would mean that because you have a decrease in exports, our IS curve would slightly go backward, and this is exactly what we are seeing in the diagram. So initially the IS curve goes from IS0 to IS1, but then it's gonna go from IS1 slightly backward. Initially our IS curve goes from the initial point, so IS0 all the way to IS1, ISG1. However, because we have a decrease in exchange rate, the IS curve would retract slightly backwards. So what's the overall change? The overall change is we go from Y0 all the way to Y1, and then we retract back from Y1 slightly to Y2. However, if we have a more elastic BP line, we would not have any difference in the analysis. Analysis would be identical. So hopefully this gives you a clear understanding of inflexible market or imperfect market of fiscal policies, monetary policies, and how they can affect the market overall in terms of their policy implications. Make sure that you have watched all the previous parts together, because these curves can be very tricky and they can be very confusing. So make sure that you watch all the parts clearly and try to understand the logic behind every single policy. To summarize it again, when we are discussing fixed exchange rate, in fixed exchange rate, fiscal policy is going to be effective, whereas monetary policy is going to be ineffective. And when we are discussing flexible exchange rate, both policies would be effective. However, fiscal policies would not be as effective as monetary policy. And when we are discussing fixed exchange rate, the fiscal policies, in situations where we have a more flatter, we are going to have a greater output, whereas if we have a more steeper or more inelastic line, we are going to have a slightly less effective policy.